Friends, very good to have you join us again as we bring the word to life. James, it's great to be here again, isn't it?
It's very good to be here, Ian. Yes, very good to see you again.
Now, before we go any further, I need to remind people of three things, don't I?
You do.
And the three
And the
things
first
are,
is,
I thought you might pick up the baton there. Okay,
almost.
the three things to do are do click on the like button. That really helps us apparently in YouTube's ratings. Do subscribe so you don't miss future episodes, and do also click on the share button and you can pass it on to friends, family. You know, you could even say to your friends, hey, it's your birthday. Why don't you have a free subscription to James and Ian talking about Bible passages? I'm sure people absolutely love that. What better present could someone receive? Now, James, I'm not going to trip you up this time. We are coming up to the Sunday Trinity 5, the fifth Sunday
Yes.
Trinity season in year C.
Yes.
So our passage is...
Inevitably, it is Luke chapter 10 and verses 38 to 42. So we dealt last week with the parable of the Good Samaritan, which comes immediately before this episode. And now we're just sort of finishing off Luke chapter 10.
We are. Now, just by way of introduction, I think two things to observe. We are dealing with quite a lot of story material, and both in Jesus' own teaching, he tells parables, he tells stories, the story of the Good Samaritan on the one hand, and of course the gospel writers contain an enormous amount of stories about who Jesus is. And I find this really fascinating, and just because of some of the contemporary studies which show how important stories are in our thinking and in our memory, and all sorts of connections in neuroscience with stories. You know, I don't know if you're familiar with sort of memory tricks where people learn to memorize lots of different things by constructing a story. So you've either got this thing of the memory palace, where you sort of go on a journey around a room and you remember things to remember in different places, or a little memory trick I actually taught this at school by a biology teacher who the rest of the school thought was completely bonkers, because he taught us all these sort of things about if you associate numbers with objects, like 1 is a gun and 2 is a shoe and 3 is a tree, and then if you're trying to remember a list of things, you put them in relation to those objects and all that kind of stuff. So, but I don't know, are you fascinated by that?
I am at one level. I have tried it and it's never worked for me. So
Okay.
but I understand. I mean, and it does seem to be highly effective for people who to remember, like order a pack of playing cards or something like that. And and it's never worked for me. I think my mind is a bit strange, but we'll probably leave that for another time.
Okay, that's fair enough.
So,
nevertheless, the fact that these stories in the Gospels really engage people, they're the things that people remember.
of course, and I mean, story is so important, isn't it? I mean, understanding ourselves very often is about remembering the stories of childhood or adulthood, and indeed at any stage of our lives, in order to understand who we are. And I think stories function all sorts of ways for us, don't they, like that? And when it comes to the Gospels, is in a sense is in the story that we discover who Jesus is.
It is. But what's also striking about these stories is that we're not left clueless, in that many of these stories that Jesus teaches end up with a sort of a summary saying, an apothegm, a little ditto motto to remember. Martha, Martha, you are anxious and troubled about many things, but one thing is necessary. Says Jesus. Mary has chosen the good portion, which will not be taken away from her. The downside of stories in the Gospels, I think there are some things to trip over, which is that I think several things. One of the things I noticed in the article, which I published yesterday, is that the lessons of the story are often implicit rather than explicit, and they're rooted in a different culture, which means that they're very easy to misunderstand. And I think they're also very easy to be pliable, so that people can impose their own interpretations on them.
And the Gospels are particularly, I think, as we were saying last week, the Gospels are written very succinctly because there were constraints about space and so on. And so they're written in a rather different way from the way we would write stories, where we give lots of detail and lots of pointers to what it actually means and so on and so forth. So we have to work that much harder at delving into context, culture, background within the canon of scripture. All those sorts of things are really, really important to make sure that we haven't gone astray. And I think those little apothegms at the end of the stories in the Gospels are really helpful indicators. I mean, we need to take them very seriously, don't we? Because that's the Gospel writer really saying, read this story, and this is going to guide you so that you don't go in the wrong direction about this. And the one at the end of this story is particularly memorable. I mean, I think that where Jesus says there is need of only one thing. I mean, that's wonderfully a wonderful kind of circumlocution. It's a mysterious, almost enigmatic saying, isn't it? And that draws you in and says, yeah, well, what is that one thing? And that actually is the big question in the story, I think. So
Yeah, indeed. If only Jesus was a bit less enigmatic.
well, yeah, but then of course. The problem with people who aren't enigmatic is that they're not very interesting. And, that's what you're drawn to friendship, aren't you, by the interest in the other person. Though they haven't actually put it all out there.
No,
There's much more to discover, and you want to be drawn into that relationship in order to discover it.
Yeah. Now, this story is a really interesting example of the way that people impose meaning on it, and some of the paradoxes that arise on there, because I think I've observed two things. One is, in a positive sense, people saying, what's needed is not for us to be rushing around busy doing practical things, but to be focusing on listening to Jesus on the one hand. And the negative one, actually somebody quite close to me in our family, who I won't mention to save their embarrassment, but one person I know very well keeps saying, oh, I'm a Martha. I'm always fretting about practical things. And isn't that terrible? Because, of course, Martha, in popular imagination, is the one who's the failure, who doesn't attend to the right thing. And Mary here is the virtuous one. So, but I don't know if you've come across different readings of this story.
Yes, inevitably, I think, and of course, the one I come across most often is, what is about spirituality, and of course, the problem with all these things is reading this text as though, and then actually the challenge of this particular text is it feels like a very familiar story. I mean, in a sense, this is the kind of thing that goes on in families who are showing hospitality, and therefore we make a leap of imagination and say, well, therefore the context must be very similar to ours, and of course, he's not. It's 2,000 years different, as it were, in a different part of the world. So that is the trap, as it were, in this, and we have to be very careful about that. But the number of times I've heard it's about spirituality, and then actually, as somebody who's really quite a practical person, I like to be in my workshop and I'm happy doing stuff, then feel condemned because I can't be sort of Mary and just sit and contemplate for hours on end. There's plenty of people like me who feel condemned by this story, as well as no doubt plenty of contemplatives who feel very affirmed by it. But actually, I don't think it's about that.
No. Well, here's the paradox as well. I mean, I think there are two paradoxes. A practical paradox, which you've hinted at, which is that, I mean, I recently read research which shows that many Christians feel as though they're expressing their faith at its most authentic when they are offering practical service and practical help, when they're actually expressing their faith in tangible ways on the one hand, and that's really significant as well in our contemporary culture. But here's the other paradox: is that, as you pointed out, the previous passage here in Luke 10 is the story of the Good Samaritan.
Yes,
what's the lesson of the Good Samaritan? The love of God, and in fact the imitation of Jesus as the one who did not pass us by on the other side, who was didn't stay away and actually came and rescued us. That actually following Jesus is about exercising that kind of practical service and love of neighbor. So it's surprising how easily maybe this is again one of the dangers of the lectionary, where we chunk up the text into these sections, these slightly artificial sections, and we detach this story from the one that immediately preceded it.
Yes, and I think the question that Luke probably is posing for us in putting these stories right next to each other is, perhaps the theme of these two stories is actually the same, and we need to think about why it's the same rather than seeing them as completely different and distinctive, and actually looking for that. And I think that there's probably a lot in that. I mean, as we know, we've often rehearsed. Jesus often tells stories about men and then about women, and they're complementary. Maybe this is another of those things.
It is. Gosh, thank you very much for highlighting that. I don't think I mentioned that. Of course, that very often in this gospel and in Acts, that the stories about men and women come in pairs. So we get
Mm.
Simeon and Anna in the temple, don't we? We get in the parables of the lost in chapter 15, we get the shepherd who's lost a sheep, we get the woman who's lost a coin, and we get the disciples with Jesus. And then, of course, in chapter 8, we get the women who support them as
Yeah.
well. So yeah,
Yeah.
as you say, we get this constant pairing together. And I'm glad we're also in good company, because I've just, a couple of commentaries that I've consulted. I know you've looked elsewhere as well. Good old weighty tome, Joel Green,
Yeah. Yeah.
and he comments about the traditional interpretation about, the importance of being devoted to Jesus rather than practical service. And he just says this. He just says that the interests of this brief narrative unit lie elsewhere.
Mm.
And Luke's narrative is manifestly concerned with the motif of hospitality. So
Yeah, yeah, and actually, it's quite interesting. I mean, I do wonder whether there's another parallel here between this story and the parable of the prodigal son, actually, where in both you have siblings,
yep.
Which is interesting, and in both hospitality in and of itself is marginalised. So in the prodigal son, it's marginalised towards grace, and here it's marginalised towards discipleship. I just kind of sensed a kind of parallel there, and but it's interesting that I don't think I've ever thought of Jesus paralleling or Luke paralleling things between an actual real story, a real life narrative account, and a parable. But I mean that
Yeah.
there's some similar themes.
And I think we also need to recognize that whereas we in our culture struggle with issues of hospitality, so actually welcoming people into your home is quite an unusual thing to do. It tends to happen with churchy middle class people, but actually outside that, it happens very little. I think in our culture in the West, it's a very odd thing for most people to invite someone into their home.
Yeah.
Whereas again, we're looking at a culture where this was much more of an expected norm. And again, of course, that is again the background to the birth narrative. I just want to beat that drum again, that about Jesus was not going in the inn. So okay, should we look at the text itself?
Yeah.
And some of those details, I mean, that sort of big picture context needs to flow in and out of the detail of the text itself. So to see whether the details as we look at the text support our sort of overview of what the issues are too. I was very struck by, just again, you look at the opening sentence, and there's two or three things already just in the very beginning there, which are extremely striking. And the first is, again, the travel motif. Now, as they went on their way, and of course, we keep recognizing that, we're quite early on in this travelogue section of Luke's gospel, where just the previous chapter 9:51, Jesus sets his face to Jerusalem, and that this travelogue lasts until chapter 19, until the triumphal entry, or in Luke's version, Cloak Sunday, because there are no palms mentioned. That's another joke for you to laugh at again.
Sorry, yes, I know. We had that on last week as well, didn't we? So
we did.
I'll try and remember to keep laughing.
Thank you very much. But so you've got this traveling motif. Now that's interesting in sense of connecting with the previous story, which is again all about the dangers of travel and about the need for friends on the way and hospitality who will welcome you. And yet they went on their way. Presumably that must have been Jesus and his disciples. But again, immediately the disciples disappear from view. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
And Jesus enters a village.
Yes, and he becomes the center of the of it all, doesn't he? Again?
Yeah, he does.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And the other thing that we notice that this is an arrangement by Luke, because which village did Jesus enter?
Yeah. Bethany. But of course,
Bethany, because that's where Martha and Mary live, as we know from John 11.
Yeah.
And of course, Bethany should be at the end of the journey,
exactly,
not at the beginning, not just leaving Galilee. So again, we can be very clear that, just as we saw last week, there was a very general temporal marker. So Luke is clearly organized his material thematically, not chronologically, in terms of saying, well, this happened in order, this happened in order.
No.
So I think that supports your observation again about Luke pairing this as a story about journey and travel and hospitality with women, and the previous passage with men.
Yeah.
Now, you mentioned hospitality being an important theme, and of course we then have Martha. I don't know if did you come across the meaning of the significance of the name Martha previously?
I don't know whether I have done, actually. I certainly hadn't remembered when I was looking at it again this time round that it does mean, it means mistress, doesn't it, or whatever. And I reading that, it makes, although Luke is never explicit about this as far as I know, it feels like Martha is the elder sister. And that's interesting, because I'm married to someone who is the eldest sister of three. And we often discuss the dynamic of the family. Let's put it like that.
Oh, right. Yes. Okay.
And I think we're kind of
Let the hearer
familiar.
understand. Yes.
Yes, let the reader understand. And I think the dynamic of the between these two sisters in a family situation, in this kind of situation, was one of those things that feels very human and very familiar to us.
Mm, mm.
And it's quite interesting. I mean, I have some friends, Nigel and Louise, who when we've been around to dinner with them, and they've got some guests and ourselves as well, and they've often told us that early on in their marriage they made a rule about how they did hospitality, that
Oh.
when one of them was out in the kitchen sorting the dinner,
Mm.
then they had to leave one of them in the room with the guests, so
Ah.
they were never both in the kitchen, in order, that was a really important thing.
Mm.
And that's the kind of story that makes this
Yeah.
situation feel very familiar, because
Yeah.
kind of Martha is really saying to Mary, you need to be with me in the kitchen, and Mary is not playing ball with that.
Mm. Mm.
She's prioritizing the guest, the guest, which is the implication of the story.
Yeah. And of course, Martha's name, as you say, mistress, is related to the Aramaic Mar, meaning Lord, as in Maranatha, Maranatha,
Maranatha, Lord, yeah.
Lord come. And interesting again that Mary is introduced quite abruptly, but a very
Yeah.
common name. I think my recollection is Richard Walcombe says that about 25%, if I remember that correctly, I don't know if you check that up, 25%
Yeah.
of women in Judea were called Mary or
Mary,
Miriam.
yeah. Miriam, yeah.
So you then very often you find that it's Mary the brother of, or Mary the sister of, or with men's
Yeah,
names.
because
So
you
and
need
so,
a
the
more
son of.
definition. Yeah.
You do need that. But welcome is really important, and Martha is doing the important thing. I mean, the language of welcome, the word Luke uses there, is kind of almost a technical term. It means receiving. And of course, although this story is connected back with the story of the Good Samaritan just before that, of course, we've had the discussion about the sending out of the 72 on mission, which we talked about 2 weeks ago.
Yes.
And of course, the key person here is the person of peace. When you visit someone's home and they receive you, then let your peace be upon them. And that's, again, there seems to be a connection here, doesn't there, with Martha?
Yeah. Martha appears to be that person in this situation, which of course would receive great affirmation, I think, from Jesus for that. And I think one of your commentators on the blog says they don't hear this story as hugely condemning Martha,
Yeah.
but rather commending Mary.
Yeah.
So I think that's really important, actually.
Yeah, it's both and rather than either or.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Yeah, the person you mentioned again is Michael Parsons. We've mentioned Michael's. Got a big shout out. Thank you, Michael, for this. Yeah, he comments. He says it's difficult to imagine that the authorial audience would understand Jesus' praise of Mary to be an implicit criticism of Martha's hospitality. A point that's underscored by the repetition of Martha's name, a rhetorical device used to indicate compassion or pity. So Jesus says, Martha, Martha, and she's been mentioned at least twice before. Martha welcomed. Martha's distracted with much serving. So her name is repeated. I think one of the other interesting things here, which again is characteristic of Luke, so it is amazing how much comes out when we pay careful attention to the way that this particular writer uses language. And something I was very struck by was that Luke's gospel is the only one in which Jesus is described as the Lord.
Yeah.
So Martha sat at the Lord's feet.
Yeah.
And then Martha said to him, Lord, why do you not care? But the Lord answered her. Now, one thing I find really interesting about that is because we in conversation talk about, oh, the Lord did this, or the Lord did that, or the Lord answered the prayer. We're so used to it. We don't notice how odd that is in the Gospels. In fact, the other Gospels don't do this at all. So I don't know if that tells us anything particular about Luke's perspective. But again, it's important sort of Christological language, isn't it?
Yes, and I think when you put it into context, I mean, one of the things that a point that David Gooding makes in his book, I don't know if we can just have a quick look at this one, according to Luke, which I think we've recommended before.
Yeah, you've mentioned that.
I mean, he points out that this is the beginning of a significant amount of Jesus' teaching in chapters 11 and 12, and in those particular passages, what the emphasis is on the momentous decision to follow Jesus, to become a disciple. So the Lord, calling Jesus the Lord, emphasizes the magnitude of this decision, and this focus of life
Mm.
to be a follower of Jesus, because we have the passages about, the attitude to the Son of Man,
Yeah.
that as being, critical. We have whole thing about being called to account. We have Jesus saying the people of Nineveh will rise up and condemn this generation because they haven't taken me seriously enough, essentially,
Yeah.
and all of that. So I think the Lord, I think it is significant here, actually,
Mm.
because this is sort of Luke saying this is big stuff. This is not
Mm.
margin. It's not some chummy little, cozy meal in Martha and Mary's house, but this is the Lord who is here.
Well, it is. And again, as I say, that word for welcome is to receive.
Mm.
And I haven't actually checked the language, but we do find that language in the beginning of the fourth gospel. He came to his own, but they did not receive him. But to those who did receive him, he gave the right to become children of God. So here we have an example, again, a positive example of reception. So yet again, there's a story here where Martha is doing the right thing in receiving Jesus, in serving him, and so on. But this takes us on then to this phrase, Mary, who sat at the Lord's feet and listened to his teaching. And again, in cultural context, just a couple of things to notice. One is that she sat at the Lord's feet. He's clearly here sitting. And of course, in cultural context, I find this something I struggle with a bit. In cultural context, you sit to teach and others sit at your feet to listen. And of course, that's why we have cathedrals, because cathedrals hold the cathedra, which is the Greek for seat, for the bishop to sit and teach. The reason I struggle with that, because I prefer to stand while I'm teaching. So I like to wander around and gesture.
It helps keep one awake, doesn't it? And alert.
It helps get the audience awake as well.
Yeah, I think it probably does. Yeah.
But then we also then have an image of a woman as disciple, which seems significant. Although, of course, it's not unique to Luke. We find examples of that elsewhere, don't we?
Yeah. But in that culture, as I think you point out in the blog, it was unusual for a woman to sit at the feet of a man.
Yes.
And Mary's affirmation by Jesus is immensely significant, I think.
And it goes across the Gospels. I mean, I think one of my favorite examples is in Matthew 12:50, where, again, Jesus' family have come to him and said he's a bit crazy, and they come to the house, and the house is full of people. They can't get to him, and word comes to him that, your mother and your brothers are looking for you.
Sisters,
and when he replies, he says, who are my mother and my brothers?
Yes.
And then he adds in the word sisters.
Yes, he does.
So we can see that the crowd around him consists of both men and women. And so there you have women equally as disciples alongside the men. Now, where does that take us, James? Because you were quite definite when we started in saying, look, that traditional reading which says Mary good, devotional, contemplative, sitting at Jesus' feet, Martha bad, too busy doing all the practical stuff, clearly is not coherent. It doesn't fit with Luke. It doesn't fit with the details of the passage. Where does it leave us then? What's the takeaway particularly from Jesus' final saying?
Yeah, well, I think it focuses on the final saying about the only one thing, and it seems to me that the only one thing is focusing on Jesus and responding to him, and that seems to be the consistent theme between the prodigals to the Good Samaritan, and this passage. That the focus of the Good Samaritan is on doing, essentially modeling what Jesus would do, and this passage here is once again the one thing is doing what Jesus would do. Focusing on the teaching of Jesus, focusing on that rather than anything else. So it seems to me that this story is really about not getting distracted from the one thing. We've got, hospitality is important, sitting at Jesus' feet, listening is important, but the real importance is focusing on Jesus, and that has a bit of coherence.
So it's not about prioritizing the listening over the hospitality. It's about both of them being focused on who it's for. So I do, again, going back to Joel Green's commentary, I mean, he makes a useful summary. The welcome Jesus seeks is not epitomized in distracted, worrisome domestic performance, but in attending to this guest whose very presence is a disclosure of the divine plan. With Jesus' presence, the world is being reconstituted, with the result that, number one, Mary, and with her those of low status accustomed to living on the margins of society, need no longer be defined by socially determined roles. And more importantly, in this context, Mary and Martha, and with them everyone else, must understand and act on the priority of attending to the guest before them, extending to Jesus and his messengers the sort of welcome in which the authentic hearing of discipleship is integral. So Joel Green is really clear that it's about a both and
Yeah.
rather than an either or. I did pick up, there's one other little story which is on a website which I rather loved, and it was about it was an American Catholic website. It says this: how will I treat Jesus when he sits at my table this holiday? Will I ignore him in favor of basting the turkey? I hope not. I hope to sit down and take in his beautiful face. I hope to spoon him the mashed potatoes that have been sitting in my crock pot since that morning, because even if I'm not a natural Martha or Mary, I'm faking it all the way. Of course, Mary chose the better part when she chose Christ. But since I want food on the table when my guests arrive, I'll agree with Cardinal Anastasio Balestrero, former Archbishop of Turin. In our house, there's room for Martha and there's room for Mary, and we must occupy both places. We must be Mary because we're welcoming the Word, and we must be Martha because we're receiving the Son of Man. Which I think is a rather helpful reading of the passage.
I thought it was beautifully put. Absolutely, yeah, absolutely beautifully put. Couldn't agree more. It was rather fun, that, but and a great example of trying to express something in contemporary language.
Yeah, so it's both and. James, thank you very much. Are you going to be preaching on this on Sunday?
I'm not actually. I'm going to be somewhere else, which I can't remember now. The diary, I have not examined the diary. I might be preaching on this, actually, to be fair. I might be preaching on this, but I don't think because we're in the middle of a sermon series, so we're not quite on the lectionary at the moment.
Okay, there we go.
Another year, I'm sure I will.
I'm sure you will. And I'm sure you'll get your diary act together before the weekend.
I hope so, yeah. I'm completely overwhelmed by other things at the moment.
Great. James, really good to chat with you again. Friends, very good for you to join us.
Yes.
Do please, again, remember to like and subscribe and share. I think there's probably a subscribe button coming up in here, and don't forget to link and pass it on. And we hope that this has helped to bring the Word to life for you, and as you pass it on to others, we'll bring the Word to life for others too. So James, goodbye, and look forward to seeing you all next time.
Yes, indeed. Goodbye.
Thanks.